There is a carving on a wall in Egypt that looks like a light bulb. Not kind of. Not if you squint. It looks like a light bulb. The way a drawing of a car looks like a car. I want to explain exactly what we know about it, what Grok AI found when it analyzed it, and why I think this question deserves more serious attention than it usually gets. Let me start with the basic facts. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is one of the best preserved ancient Egyptian temples still standing. It was built around 300 BCE during the Ptolemaic period. That is the era after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. The temple covers roughly 40,000 square meters. It has multiple underground chambers called crypts. These crypts were not open to regular people. Only initiated priests could enter them. The imagery inside those restricted spaces tends to carry more specific and technical meaning than what appears on the public outer walls. That detail matters a lot to me. When something is placed in a restricted underground space in a civilization that carefully controlled sacred knowledge, it is worth asking what exactly they were protecting and why. Now, here is the thing about the carving itself. Inside the south crypts of this temple, there is a relief that shows a large elongated bulb-shaped object. Inside the bulb, a serpent floats from the base toward the tip. The serpent does not touch the outer walls of the bulb. At the base of the bulb, where it connects to a vertical column, there is a junction feature. Mainstream Egyptology explains this as a lotus flower with a serpent emerging from it. Standard creation myth symbolism. The sun god Ra, emerging from the primordial waters. That is the official answer. It has been the official answer for over 60 years. The way I understand it, that explanation is not wrong exactly. It is just not the only thing that fits the image. In 1966, an Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Garn was looking at photographs of these carvings for completely unrelated professional reasons. He had no interest in ancient mysteries. He was not looking for lost technology. But when he reached this specific carving, his professional training made him stop. What he saw looked to him like a Crookes tube. A Crookes tube is a glass vacuum tube with a cathode at one end and an anode at the other. When electrical current passes through it, a glowing beam travels through the vacuum inside. The beam does not touch the glass walls. British physicist William Crookes developed these in the 1870s. They led directly to the discovery of X-rays and eventually to the cathode ray tubes inside 20th century televisions. The comparison Garn made in 1966 has never gone away. Mainstream academics dismiss it repeatedly. It keeps coming back. That alone tells me something is worth examining here. Now let me explain what Grok AI actually did with this. In 2025, Grok AI was given every published academic analysis of the Dendera carvings that exists in the research record. It was also given something crucial that previous researchers did not use properly: precise dimensional data from high-resolution photogrammetric surveys of the crypt surfaces. These measurements are accurate to fractions of a millimeter. Alongside those measurements, the AI received dimensional specifications for functional electrical components. Crookes tubes, vacuum tubes, and related devices at various scales and configurations. What the AI was doing here is important to understand. It was not doing art history. It was not asking what the image means symbolically. It was asking a technical documentation question. Does this image accurately describe a specific physical object at a level of precision that goes beyond surface resemblance? Those are very different questions, and the answers are very different. The dimensional comparison produced a specific result. The proportions of the Dendera carving are consistent with a functional vacuum tube design. The ratio of the bulb's length to its maximum diameter. The position of the internal element relative to the overall bulb dimensions. The proportional relationship between the base connection feature and the bulb body. All of these fall within 5% variance compared to known functional Crookes tube designs. To me, that number is significant. When human artists depict symbolic imagery from memory or cultural convention, the dimensional variation across similar elements typically runs much higher. 5% is engineering-level consistency. It is not the kind of precision you produce accidentally when painting a religious symbol, but the proportions alone are not the most interesting part. What really made me stop and think was the internal element positioning. The serpent inside the bulb floats without touching the outer walls. That is not just a visual choice. That is a physical behavior. In a functioning vacuum tube, the electrical discharge travels through the vacuum without touching the glass walls. That is what happens when the device works correctly. The image is not just shaped like a Crookes tube. The behavior it depicts inside the bulb matches what a Crookes tube actually does when it operates. That is a specific technical observation, not a vague resemblance, a specific matching of form and function. Now here is something that almost never gets mentioned in popular discussions of this topic. The carvings in the inner chambers are accompanied by hieroglyphic inscriptions. These have been translated by Egyptologists. Their translations have been in the published academic record since the late 19th century. The hieroglyphic text accompanying the famous carving describes the depicted object using language that translates most commonly as something like the Great One who illuminates, or that which gives light. Mainstream Egyptology explains this as a reference to Ra, the sun god, as the ultimate source of light and illumination. The lotus and serpent represent the sun's emergence from the primordial waters at creation. Internally consistent, fits the religious framework perfectly. But here is what I find genuinely difficult to dismiss. If you wanted to explain the theological significance of an actual light-producing device to a religious audience, that is precisely the description you would use. You would frame it in divine language. You would connect it to existing sacred concepts. You would make it comprehensible within the framework your audience already understood. The two interpretations are linguistically indistinguishable from each other based on the inscription alone. What the text cannot do is rule out the functional interpretation. And yet, mainstream interpretation has treated the theological reading as the only one worth considering since the beginning. Grok AI flagged the hieroglyphic inscription as the most genuinely ambiguous element in the entire dataset. That assessment seems right to me. Both interpretations fit. Neither can be eliminated by the language alone. Let me add the other layers of evidence now, because this does not exist in isolation. The Baghdad Battery. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig discovered a clay jar about 14 centimeters tall near Baghdad. Inside the jar was a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod. The whole assembly was sealed with asphalt. When researchers built a replica and filled it with an acidic liquid, like grape juice or vinegar, it produced approximately 1.1 volts of electrical current. The construction is consistent with a basic galvanic cell, the same fundamental principle that powers modern batteries. This object dates to roughly 250 BCE. That is almost exactly the same period when the Dendera reliefs were carved. What this establishes is not that ancient people had light bulbs. What it establishes is that the basic principle of generating electrical current was understood in the ancient world during the period when these carvings were made. The question of ancient electrical knowledge is no longer a question about whether any such knowledge existed. The evidence says it did. The question is only about how far it extended. Going from a 1.1 volt galvanic cell to vacuum tube technology is a significant jump. I want to be clear about that. A basic battery producing enough current for simple electroplating is a very different thing from a device that produces light through electrical discharge in a glass vacuum. But the distance between those two things is now a matter of degree rather than a matter of whether any electrical understanding existed at all. That is a meaningful shift in how we frame the question. Now the soot problem. This one is deeply practical, and I think it deserves more attention than it gets. Many of the most precise and elaborate paintings and carvings in ancient Egyptian structures are located in places with no natural light whatsoever. Deep underground chambers, narrow corridors with no windows, tomb interiors cut through solid rock where an open flame would exhaust the available oxygen quickly. The mainstream explanation for how ancient Egyptians illuminated these spaces is polished metal mirrors that redirected sunlight progressively deeper through openings, supplemented by oil lamps when necessary. Here is the problem with that explanation. Oil lamps produce soot. Candles produce soot. Torches produce soot. Any combustion-based light source leaves a carbon residue on nearby surfaces. Researchers have examined ceiling samples from multiple Dendera crypt chambers using chemical analysis. In several of the most elaborately decorated spaces, the carbon residue that should be there is simply absent. The mainstream response is that ventilation systems may have removed it, or that very clean burning wax was used. Neither explanation accounts for the pattern across all the affected locations. The evidence that would support the mainstream answer is, in many of these specific locations, not there. This does not prove electric lighting. What it does is create a specific, measurable gap in the mainstream account. The explanation for how they worked in darkness has evidence that should exist. In several key locations, that evidence does not. Now let me explain the multi-carving finding, because this is the detail I find most compelling. The famous carving is not the only one. Grok AI analyzed at least 5 distinct depictions of the same bulb form across the south crypt walls. Each one varies in specific ways, while keeping the same fundamental structure. In some, The internal serpent is positioned closer to the base. In others, it extends further toward the tip. In at least one, the overall proportions of the bulb differ slightly, while preserving the same structural relationship between internal element and outer container. The base connection feature remains proportionally consistent across all examples, even as the internal positioning changes. The AI's analysis looked at this variation and identified a specific pattern. The structural proportions of the device remain stable across all 5 carvings. The position of the internal element varies in a way that corresponds to where an electrical discharge would appear in a Crookes tube operating under different power levels. Lower power, the beam stays closer to the cathode. Higher power, it extends further toward the anode. Now here is the interpretive question that matters. In symbolic religious art, variation follows meaning. Artists change elements to tell different parts of a story, emphasize different theological ideas, or reflect the preferences of different craftsmen. In technical documentation, variation follows function. The structural dimensions of a device stay consistent because the device has to work. The moving or active components appear in different positions to show different operational states. The pattern Grok AI found in the Dendera multi-carving set matches the technical documentation pattern more closely than the symbolic variation pattern. The structural dimensions are stable. The internal element positions vary systematically. That is what engineering illustrations do. That is not what religious symbol variants typically do. To be completely clear about what the analysis established and what it did not. It did not prove the ancient Egyptians had electric lighting. The proportional consistency could still be coincidental. The hieroglyphic translation is genuinely ambiguous. The Baghdad battery does not demonstrate vacuum tube technology. The absent suit has possible, alternative explanations. What the analysis produced is something more precise than what existed before. It assembled the most rigorous technical case for taking this question seriously. It identified exactly which elements of the evidence are strong, which are ambiguous, and what additional evidence would be needed to settle the matter in either direction. That is a meaningful contribution, not proof. A better specified version of an open question. The way I see it, the carving has been on that wall for over 2,000 years. Whatever it depicts, it has been asking the same question the entire time. Grok AI asked that question more precisely than it had ever been asked before. The answer is still open, but the question is now sharper, more specific, and more testable than it was before a computational analysis was applied to it. What I think this means, practically, is straightforward. Future studies using higher resolution scans, three-dimensional modeling, independent statistical analysis, or multiple AI systems running separate comparisons could either strengthen or weaken the operational hypothesis. The evidence is now specific enough to test. That is different from where this debate was sitting for the previous 60 years. It was stuck in the territory of subjective visual impressions, where reasonable people could disagree indefinitely without either side being able to demonstrate anything measurable. Now there are specific measurable relationships between repeated visual elements that can be analyzed, challenged, and refined by additional research. That is progress, even if the ultimate answer is still uncertain. For me, The most important thing I take from all of this is not whether the ancient Egyptians had light bulbs. It is that a 2,000-year-old carving in a restricted underground temple chamber, accompanied by hieroglyphic text, describing something that gives light, showing proportions consistent with a functional electrical device at engineering-level precision, in a period when we have physical evidence of basic electrical generation in the same region, deserves to be examined with modern tools and open methods, rather than dismissed with pre-decided conclusions. The ceiling soot is absent. The hieroglyphic description is ambiguous. The proportions are precise. The Baghdad battery exists. None of those facts are going away. They all sit there together, and they do not fit neatly into a single comfortable explanation. So for me, the main thing is this: the Dendera carving is not solved. It is not a confirmed ancient light bulb, but it is also not a settled case of obvious lotus flower symbolism. It is a genuinely open technical question that now has the most rigorous analysis it has ever received. And the analysis says it is worth looking much more carefully. That is where I understand this to stand right now.